Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we are stepping into the dust and sweat of ancient Egyptian daily life, into mud brick courtyards that smell of smoke and goats, kitchens where bread tastes of stone grit, and fields where the sun beats down long before the gods bother to listen to your prayers. Before we join the farmers in their fields or sit in the shadow of the temples they funded but could never enter, do me one small favour. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. I've linked my favourite pair in the description. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. The Nile was called Egypt's eternal gift, and in a sense it was. Without its dependable floodwaters, the land would have been nothing but sand, stone, and scorching wind. Each year the river swelled, spilling dark silt onto the floodplain, and each year the same miracle was repeated. Fields reborn, crops planted, and lives temporarily sustained. Hymns praised this cycle as proof of a divine favour, and officials dutifully carved its abundance into stone. From the perspective of Egypt's rulers, eternity flowed as smoothly as the river itself, reliable, unchanging, and benevolent. Yet for the millions who lived along its banks, eternity was less a blessing than a sentence. For what never changed was not prosperity, but monotony. And so when we speak of daily life in ancient Egypt, we must look past the glittering images carved for eternity. The truth lies not in painted banquets or golden coffins, but in the dust of villages, the smoke of hearths, and the repetitive grind that consumed most lives. If Egypt's monuments were built to last for eternity, its homes were built to last for a season, perhaps two if luck held. Along the narrow strip of green beside the Nile, villages rose from mud brick, only to sink back into it with the next flood. The material was cheap and abundant, clay mixed with straw shaped into bricks and baked beneath the same sun that would eventually bake the bricks to dust again. Whole neighbourhoods were patched and repatched until they resembled more mound than house. To walk through a settlement was not to see permanence, but improvisation. Walls leaning precariously, roofs sagging under bundles of reeds, alleys so narrow that neighbours could pass goods through windows without stepping outside. Here was Egypt's true architecture, not the pyramids, but the sagging shells in which most people spent their lives. Inside, the homes were not the serene sanctuaries painted in tomb art, but smoky, dim, and close. Most houses had 2 or 3 rooms at most, each one small enough that every sound and smell filled the entire space. The hearth, little more than a clay-lined pit, smoked constantly, leaving walls blackened and lungs stung. There were no chimneys to carry the fumes away. Smoke rose, clung to the ceiling, and drifted back down to settle on clothing, bedding, and eyes. The air smelled of char, goat dung used for fuel, and sweat trapped by heat. To step inside was to step into a haze that coated the throat and left a taste of ash at the back of the tongue. Yet it was home, and families returned to it each evening because there was no alternative. Flooring was simple earth, sometimes tamped down, sometimes smeared with a mixture of clay and straw. In some households, dung was spread across the floor and packed to harden, a practice that sealed cracks but did nothing to improve the smell. Dust rose with every step, mixing with smoke in the air, while fleas and other pests nested easily in the mats and corners. Furniture, where it existed, was rudimentary. A stool of lashed wood, a low table, perhaps a headrest to keep one's face from pressing into the crawling reed mat at night. Most slept on woven mats spread directly over the floor, mats that collected lice, fleas and mites with the same enthusiasm as they collected dust. The morning routine of scratching was less an annoyance than a certainty. Everyone did it, and no amount of washing could undo it. Light filtered only through small slits or holes left in the walls, and in the evenings the rooms grew dim quickly. Oil lamps provided some relief, but their smoke only thickened the air, adding the reek of burning fat to the already crowded mixture of odours. Shadows shifted across walls that were themselves unsteady, their plaster cracked and flaking, revealing the straw within. Children played in the corners with toys made of clay or wood scraps, their laughter echoing strangely in the enclosed space, while outside the constant braying of donkeys and barking of dogs seeped through every crack. Privacy was non-existent. A family of 5 or 6 shared the same rooms, the same air, and the same smells. Their lives stacked atop one another with no separation. The exterior of these homes looked no more impressive. Roofs were flat, built from wooden beams overlaid with reeds and mud plaster. In the searing heat of summer, families often slept on the rooftops, stretched under the open sky where at least a breeze could pass. From above, villages resembled sprawling collections of clay boxes, each roof crowded with sleeping bodies or drying laundry. The walls cracked easily under the changing heat and floods, requiring constant patching. Each season brought new repairs, and the cycle of crumbling and rebuilding mirrored the broader cycle of Egyptian life. Nothing stable for long, everything requiring maintenance, everything eventually claimed by the river and the sand. Even wealth did not guarantee comfort. The houses of better-off families were larger, with more rooms, perhaps even a small courtyard with shade. Yet the same mud brick made up their walls, the same smoke filled their hearths, and the same dust clung to their clothing. They might enjoy a little more space, or own wooden furniture instead of reed mats, but the sensory palette was the same. Heat, smoke, pests and dust. Wealth showed in decoration, painted walls, jars of scented oils, perhaps a carved wooden chest, but the foundation remained fragile. In the end, the house of an overseer crumbled with the same inevitability as that of a farmer. Eternity was for stone, not clay. Daily life inside these spaces was shaped by their limitations. The lack of windows kept the heat stifling by day, and at night the rooms grew damp and oppressive. Insects thrived, drawn to food scraps or animal hides stored within. Cats prowled through the dark, a welcome defence against rodents that otherwise gnawed at grain stores. Chickens and goats were often kept close, adding their smells and noise to the household. Children cried in the night, and their wails carried through walls no thicker than a handspan, merging into the general hum of village life. Sleep was less a retreat than an uneasy truce with noise, itching, and the stifling press of air. To move through one of these homes was to encounter layers of sensation that could never be fully ignored. Your bare feet pressed into cool, uneven earth. Your hands brushed past walls that shed plaster onto your skin. Smoke clung to your hair, while the sour tang of beer hung in the air from jars left uncovered. Each corner seemed to hold a reminder of fragility, cracks widening, mats fraying, jars chipped. And yet these were the spaces where families gathered, where food was prepared, where births and deaths occurred. They were both shelters and traps, protecting from the desert sun while sealing in every discomfort of life. The fragility of these homes also shaped how memory functioned in Egypt. While tombs and temples carved in stone remained for centuries, the houses of ordinary people melted away, leaving behind little trace. Archaeologists uncover outlines of rooms, hearths filled with ash, and broken potsherds. But the walls themselves vanished almost as soon as their builders were gone. This impermanence was accepted as natural, even inevitable. Why build for eternity when eternity belonged only to kings and gods? For common people, life was lived in spaces that were temporary by design, constantly maintained, and ultimately erased. Their memories did not linger in stone inscriptions, but in oral tradition, in work passed on to children, and in the weary rhythm of survival. The sensory world of these homes carried into every part of life. The smoke that stung eyes in the morning was the same smoke that flavoured food in the evening. The itch of pests was as constant as the ache of hunger. Dust settled on bodies as easily as it settled on jars of grain. To speak of daily life in Egypt without speaking of these sensations is to miss its essence. The pyramids and temples tell us about eternity, but it was in these smoky, crumbling rooms that people actually lived. Here they ate, prayed, fought, made love, gave birth, and died, all under roofs that sagged and walls that cracked, and it was here that mornings began. Each day opened within these dim, smoky spaces as families stirred on reed mats, brushing away lice and dust, stretching sore muscles, and preparing for the repetition ahead. Before the sun could rise fully and burn away the coolness of dawn, households turned toward the rituals of survival, washing with Nile water, chewing stale bread, muttering prayers to clay gods, and preparing to step once more into the eternal monotony of labour. To understand mornings in ancient Egypt, one must picture not sunlight streaming into spacious courtyards, but bodies rising slowly from mats on earthen floors, in rooms already thick with heat, dust and smoke. The homes themselves, fragile as they were, shaped the rhythm of waking. Cramped interiors meant there was no possibility of slipping quietly from bed. When one person stirred, everyone else followed, stretching sore backs and swatting at the fleas and lice that had spent the night feeding freely. The first sounds of the day were not birds greeting the dawn, though ibises and herons did stir along the Nile. They were the coughs of men clearing smoke from their lungs, the muttered complaints of women brushing hair tangled with dust, and the sharp cries of children scratching irritated skin. Waking up was less about readiness for the day than resignation to discomfort. The first act after stirring was often a form of cleaning, though by modern standards it brought little actual cleanliness. Jars of Nile water, drawn the previous evening or fetched by children before sunrise, stood near hearths or doorways. This water, cloudy with sediment and carrying the smell of algae or rot, was used for rinsing faces and hands. In truth, it was the same river water that received waste upstream, but it was the only option. A splash across the face cooled the skin briefly, but the brackish taste that lingered on the lips reminded users of its mixed origins. Men and women cupped handfuls to rinse mouths, spitting into corners, hoping to wash away the sourness of sleep, though never escaping the persistent, yet grit of sand. It was less about purity and more about ritual, an acknowledgement that the body needed at least symbolic renewal before another day of labour. Children were dragged into this routine, whether they liked it or not. Mothers wiped their faces briskly with wet cloths, scrubbing hard enough to redden skin, more to remove visible dirt than to banish anything invisible. The children resisted, squirming, whining, scratching their own scalps. Delousing was a daily necessity. Mothers sat children between their knees and searched through hair with fingernails, cracking lice between their fingers or scraping them into jars of oil. Some families shaved children's heads entirely, leaving a single side lock to reduce the battlefield for vermin, but even this was no guarantee. Lice lived in bedding, mats, and clothing, and no washing could truly dislodge them. The scratching never ceased, an ambient rhythm of village life as much as the buzzing of flies. Adults fared little better. Men scratched at bites along their arms and legs, often muttering curses, while women combed through their own hair with rough wooden picks. Fleas leapt from reed mats to legs the moment bare feet touched the floor. The smell of sweat, already clinging from the heat of the night, mixed with the faintly fishy odour of river water used for rinsing. Soap in the form of natron or clay mixed with ash might have been used occasionally, but it was more abrasive than cleansing, leaving skin dry and cracked. For most, a rough cloth or handful of sand rubbed against the skin sufficed. The sensation was more of scraping than washing, a practical attempt to dislodge dirt and insects rather than achieve anything resembling freshness. For those with means, a little oil or resin offered relief. A dab of scented resin rubbed through the hair disguised odours and created the illusion of polish, though it quickly attracted dust in the dry air. Wealthier families burned small cones of perfumed fat that melted slowly through the day, dripping into hair and releasing fragrance that masked the pervasive smell of sweat and smoke. Such luxuries were rare, however. Most Egyptians carried their bodies into the day with the same earthy odours that filled their homes: smoke from the hearth, the animal musk of goats tethered nearby, and the persistent sharpness of onions stored in baskets. To live in Egypt was to live with layers of smell, so constant that only outsiders might notice their intensity. Mourning also carried its religious duties. Even the poorest households had small niches carved into walls or shrines made of clay, where crude figurines of protective gods stood. Before stepping into the day's work, families placed small offerings: a scrap of bread, a splash of beer, a flower if one was at hand. Prayers were murmured to household gods like Bes or Taweret, protectors against snakes, childbirth, or evil spirits. The act was rarely elaborate: a few words whispered into the smoky air, a bow of the head, a flick of incense or resin dropped onto the hearth's embers. Yet it mattered, because no one wanted to face the hazards of fieldwork, childbirth, or pests without divine favour. Religion was less about devotion than insurance, a way of ensuring that the endless discomforts of life did not turn into calamities. Children watched and imitated, sometimes earnestly, sometimes distractedly. Little boys might bow their heads as fathers did, while little girls carried scraps to shrines with solemn expressions, only to return moments later to swat at flies. Some mornings the rituals were hurried, skipped entirely if water was low or tempers short, but even then the absence was noted with unease. If something went wrong later in the day, a tool breaking, a child falling ill, a flood destroying crops, it was easy to blame insufficient piety. Better to give the gods a token before stepping into the sun, however rushed or resentful it might be. The act of grooming and preparation extended beyond washing. Women adjusted clothing, tying linen kilts or dresses with practiced speed, while men bound loincloths or wrapped simple garments at the waist. Clothing was rarely clean. Sweat stains, frayed edges, and patches told the story of garments worn until they disintegrated. Washing clothes in the Nile was laborious, involving beating them against stones until fibres broke down. The smell of unwashed fabric mingled with bodies and smoke, adding another note to the morning chorus of odours. Jewellery, beads of faience, shell, or bone, was worn as both decoration and protection. Amulets strung on cords meant to guard against misfortune. These were small attempts at dignity, gestures of humanity in a world where control was scarce. As families prepared to leave their homes, the village itself grew louder. Coughs, brays, and muttered voices rose into a collective hum. Neighbours exchanged quick greetings, not out of joy, but necessity. One never knew when a word might be needed to borrow a tool or request help later. The ground was already dusty underfoot, the air alive with flies that multiplied in every refuse pile. Dogs prowled the lanes, snapping at each other over scraps. Children carried jars to fetch more water, their small bodies already bent beneath the weight, while elders leaned on sticks, blinking against the rising sun. Hygiene and preparation were communal acts, carried out in parallel by dozens of households, each one echoing the same routines. The morning's rituals did not erase discomfort, but they imposed a kind of order. To rinse one's face, scrape one's body, pick lice from one's hair, mutter a prayer, adjust clothing. These were the gestures that divided night from day, chaos from endurance. They gave the illusion that one entered the day fresh, even though the same sweat, dust and pests waited beyond the door. It was less about cleansing than signalling readiness to oneself and to others that the cycle was beginning again. And in this sense, hygiene was as much performance as practicality, a shared agreement that the body had been reset, however imperfectly, for the work ahead. By the time the sun's first rays fully cleared the horizon, most households had completed these rituals. Faces were wet, hair roughly combed, amulets hung in place. Children were scrubbed and scratched, adults perfumed faintly with resin or not at all. Shrines bore their scraps of offering, hearths smouldered with new smoke, and the air of the village carried a mingled weight of incense, dung, and dust. It was not purity, but it was preparation. And with these gestures completed, the body could turn toward the next necessity of life. Food, however gritty or sour, to provide the strength to endure the hours to come. Meals in ancient Egypt were never feasts, in the sense later art or modern imagination suggests. They were practical, monotonous, and often unpleasant, designed not to delight the senses, but to keep the body just functional enough to labour another day. Archaeologists may find elaborate banquet scenes painted on tomb walls, filled with neatly stacked loaves, gleaming jars of wine, and baskets of gleaming fruit. The reality was considerably less appealing. Bread that tasted of dust and stone, beer that resembled slurry more than drink, onions sharp enough to sting eyes, and fish that smelled of rot even before reaching the mouth. To eat in ancient Egypt was to consume necessity, not pleasure, and the body paid for that necessity in toothaches, stomach cramps, and the relentless presence of parasites. Bread was the foundation of every meal, the staple on which everything else rested. Made from emmer wheat or barley, it was ground by hand on sandstone querns, a process that inevitably ground fragments of stone into the flour itself. Each bite of bread carried with it the faint crunch of grit, a grinding that slowly wore teeth down to stumps. Skeletons from ancient cemeteries revealed jaws with enamel nearly erased, abscesses festering where nerves had been exposed. To eat was to hasten the decline of one's mouth. But no one had a choice. Bread could be shaped into loaves or flat cakes, baked hard to last several days, softened by soaking in beer, or crumbled into stews. It carried the faint sourness of fermentation, sometimes the musty tang of mould, and always the unmistakable taste of stone. Children learned early that chewing bread meant chewing sand, a daily reminder that nourishment came with pain. Onions and garlic accompanied this bread as the next most common staple. They grew easily, stored well, and provided enough flavour to mask the staleness of other foods. They were so valuable, they were sometimes given as wages, handfuls of bulbs handed out to labourers alongside jars of beer. Their sharpness filled homes, clung to clothing, and lingered on breath. To walk through a village was to smell not just smoke and sweat, but the constant pungency of onions roasting, boiling, or eaten raw. They were believed to have protective properties, warding off illness, though their real service was far more practical. They kept hunger at bay and added enough bite to make another loaf of gritty bread seem tolerable. A poor man's basket might contain little else, and so his meals repeated with weary predictability. Bread, onion, and beer, over and over, until life itself tasted of repetition. Legumes such as lentils, chickpeas, and beans appeared when available, boiled into stews or mashed into pastes. They offered protein, though they also offered flatulence. and the stomach discomforts that came with poorly digested meals. For variety, herbs and wild greens were collected from riverbanks, though these often came with grit and insects still clinging to their leaves. The wealthy might enjoy honey, figs, dates, or pomegranates, but, for the majority, sweetness was a rare luxury, experienced only at festivals or through the diluted tang of fruit steeped into beer. To crave sweetness in Egypt was to crave absence, a yearning rarely fulfilled. Fish supplied another essential but troubling source of food. The Nile teemed with them. Tilapia, catfish, eels, and fishing was common. Yet without refrigeration, fish spoiled quickly in the heat. They were dried, salted, or smoked in attempts at preservation, but even preserved fish carried a powerful odour that clung to homes, hands, and breath. When eaten fresh, they often tasted of the muddy river itself, with bones that lodged in throats and scales that escaped rough cleaning. When eaten preserved, they brought saltiness so intense it burned the tongue, or a sourness that made one gag. Nonetheless, they were eaten because they filled the belly, because to reject them was to go hungry. Parasites from fish lodged themselves in intestines and bladders, making urination painful, bellies distended, and lives shorter. But in the eternal calculus of Egyptian survival, parasites were accepted as the price of protein. Meat, by contrast, was rare. Chickens and pigs were kept, goats and cattle too, but they were too valuable alive to slaughter often. Meat appeared at festivals, sacrifices, or in wealthier households, roasted or stewed, seasoned with herbs. For ordinary families, the smell of roasting meat wafted only occasionally through villages, a reminder that such abundance was meant for others. Most Egyptians tasted meat rarely, if ever, outside ritual occasions, and when they did, it was usually the tough, stringy parts that elites had discarded. Even these scraps carried significance, shared among families as a momentary break in monotony, a taste of richness, destined not to last. If bread was the base of the diet, beer was its lifeblood. Egyptian beer was not the frothy, crisp drink imagined today, but a thick, cloudy liquid brewed from bread itself. Loaves were baked half-cooked, crumbled into jars of water, left to ferment, then strained through reeds. The result was a beverage full of residue, sometimes flecked with floating grains, always sour and slightly gritty. It was consumed by everyone, men, women, children, not for pleasure, but because the alternative was river water, alive with disease. Beer was safer, if unappealing, and it provided calories as well as hydration. Yet it also dulled the senses, leaving mouths coated and bellies heavy. To drink was to accept a sour aftertaste that clung long after the jar was drained, an unavoidable part of life that blurred hunger without ever satisfying it fully. Wine existed, but like meat, it was reserved for elites and special occasions. Grapes required irrigation and labour beyond the reach of most households. When wine did appear, it was rich and sweet, served at feasts or poured in temples, but it was never the daily drink of the masses. For them, intoxication came from beer, from jars passed around at festivals, or shared in courtyards. After long days, beer fueled the body for labour, but it also fueled the rare moments of release, when songs, dances and laughter filled the same smoky spaces that usually echoed with grinding and coughing. Hunger was never absent. Even in good years, the distribution of food left many households on the edge. Grain collected for taxes filled temple granaries, while ordinary families stretched rations to cover lean months. Children cried in hunger, their bellies bloated from malnutrition, their mothers scraping jars for the last smear of oil or beans. In famine years, desperation grew acute. Stories survive of families eating papyrus roots, wild grasses, even leather softened in water. Eternity, so often celebrated in hymns, could feel like nothing more than the eternal gnawing of an empty stomach. Meals, such as they were, took place in the same cramped, smoky homes, already filled with pests and odours. Families sat on the floor, passing loaves, dipping them into bowls of stew, biting into onions that made eyes water. The air smelled of roasted legumes, sour beer, and bodies pressed close. Dogs hovered for scraps, flies landed freely, and grit from bread settled between teeth. Eating was noisy, the crunch of stone particles in bread, the slurping of beer, the complaints of children dissatisfied with what little they received. It was not a social ritual in the modern sense. It was a practical act, carried out swiftly, repeated endlessly, endured more than enjoyed. The body absorbed the consequences of this diet. Dental decay was rampant, stomach parasites commonplace, malnutrition evident in bones and bellies. To live on onions and bread was to survive but never thrive, to carry forward just enough strength to till another field, haul another jar, grind another batch of grain. Meals were measured not in delight but in endurance, another link in the chain of repetition that bound Egypt's millions to their fate. The shimmering banquets painted for eternity were lies meant to soothe the wealthy. The reality was that eternity tasted of grit, sour beer, and the sharp bite of onions. And yet, for all its discomforts, food was indispensable. However monotonous, however unpleasant, meals divided the day into survivable pieces. The morning bite of bread and onion allowed the body to endure until midday, when another loaf, another onion, another jar of beer repeated the cycle. In the evening, the same foods appeared again, offering no novelty, but at least filling the stomach before another night on reed mats. Eating was never leisurely. It was a practical submission to necessity. To refuse the bread, beer, or onion was to collapse. Food was not joy but fuel, consumed only so the body could return to the fields, workshops, and kilns that demanded its labour. Agriculture was the backbone of the entire society. The reason temples gleamed, officials kept their ledgers, and pharaohs could raise monuments to their own eternity. For the vast majority of the population, life meant bending over fields of barley and emmer wheat, sweating beneath a sun that showed no mercy. To imagine a farmer's day is to imagine an existence tethered to the river's moods, obedient not only to the rhythms of nature, but to the ever-present demands of state officials. The Nile dictated what was possible, and the authorities dictated what would be taken. Whatever remained was what you and your family lived on. If the pests, floods, or droughts left you anything at all, the annual flood determined everything. When the river swelled, it spread a blanket of black silt across the floodplain, making planting possible. When it failed to rise high enough, famine loomed. When it rose too high, villages drowned and fields washed away. Farmers watched the water with the same intensity priests reserved for the gods. For the river's level meant the difference between survival and starvation. And yet, whether the harvest was abundant or thin, taxes did not adjust. State scribes calculated expected yields in advance, and quotas were fixed accordingly. If the land underperformed, that was your misfortune, not theirs. The shortfall would be made up by your household, through more grain, through labour, or through the seizure of livestock. The Nile might be a gift, but it was one endlessly re-gifted upward to temples and officials, leaving little in the hands of those who coaxed the crops from the mud. The tools of farming were crude, unchanged for centuries. Wooden ploughs, often pulled by oxen or donkeys, cut shallow lines in the soil. Sickles with flint blades harvested grain, their edges sharp at first but quickly dulled by grit. Hoes and baskets completed the repertoire, all simple implements that demanded muscle more than skill. There was nothing romantic in the rhythm of agriculture here. only repetition. Men bent to weed, women scattered seed, children shooed birds from fields with sticks, and all of them returned home at night, with backs aching and hands blistered. The constant bending meant spines curved prematurely, and skeletons from Egyptian cemeteries show arthritis setting in by middle age, the body worn down by decades of identical motions. The labour was conducted under watchful eyes. Overseers, employed by the state or temples, stalked the edges of fields carrying sticks. Their role was to keep the pace, to ensure quotas were met, to remind labourers that the work was not merely for themselves, but for the system. A moment's pause could invite a barked command or the sting of a blow. Farmers were not free to work at their own speed. They were components in a machine of grain production, interchangeable and expendable. Songs may have been sung to pass the time, but the undertone was always one of compulsion. Behind every harvested sheaf of barley was the threat of punishment. Behind every basket carried to the granary, the knowledge that most of its contents would never return home. The environment itself provided no mercy. The sun rose hot and grew hotter, pressing down until skin burned and lips cracked. Insects swarmed endlessly, mosquitoes rising from the river, flies clustering at the corners of eyes and mouths. Gnats crawled beneath clothing, biting at sweaty skin, impossible to avoid. The mud itself was treacherous, clinging to legs, sucking at sandals, pulling down animals that strayed too far into the shallows. Along the riverbanks, crocodiles lurked, and stories circulated of workers dragged beneath the water while fetching jars or chasing livestock. Snakes hid in reeds, scorpions scuttled through fields, and bites were treated with prayers and poultices that offered more comfort than cure. To labour in the fields was to labour under constant assault, not just from the overseer's stick, but from the land itself. And yet, despite these dangers and discomforts, work never paused. Seasons dictated an endless cycle, ploughing after the flood, planting, weeding, harvesting, threshing, storing. The rhythm left little room for variation, and no season offered respite. In flood years, families might be drafted into repair work for dikes and canals. Their labour demanded to keep the irrigation system functioning. In dry years, more hours were spent hauling water by hand, pouring it from jars onto thirsty crops, praying the effort would be enough. The Nile's generosity was unpredictable, but the demand for labour was constant. Eternity, in this sense, meant repetition without end. The same movements performed generation after generation. What little grain remained after taxes was stored precariously. Baskets and clay jars sealed with mud kept pests at bay only temporarily. Mice and rats gnawed their way inside. Beetles infested the stores, and mould crept in from dampness. Families rationed carefully, stretching supplies through lean months, eating bread that grew harder and more sour as weeks passed. For many, the fear was not the flood or the overseer, but the gnawing certainty that the store would run out before the next harvest. This constant anxiety shaped every meal, every decision, every calculation of how much could be spared for offerings or trade. Survival was always conditional, always precarious, always one poor harvest away from collapse. Women and children joined in this labour as readily as men. Children chased birds from fields, clapping sticks together, their small bodies already pressed into service. Women bent alongside men to plant seed, weed and harvest, their backs aching from a double burden of fieldwork and domestic chores. There was no gendered sanctuary from agricultural toil. The entire household's energy was consumed by the same demands. Even the elderly contributed as best they could, guarding stores, watching children, or tending animals too small to matter to the tax collector, but vital to a family's survival. Everyone laboured, because without everyone's effort, the risk of hunger grew acute. Festivals and rituals were tied to this agricultural rhythm, offering moments of relief, but also reinforcing its inevitability. Processions thanked the Nile for its flood. Sacrifices were made to gods associated with fertility. Hymns were sung to ensure the harvest. But beneath the prayers and celebrations lay the unchanging truth. If the crops failed, it was the farmers who starved first, not the priests or the pharaoh. The system insulated the powerful from scarcity by extracting more from those already closest to it. Religion provided the language of gratitude, but daily life provided the experience of exhaustion. Archaeological evidence of this labour remains etched in bodies. Skeletal remains show vertebrae compressed, knees ground down, teeth worn to stumps, fractures healed poorly, evidence of injuries sustained in fields that received no rest or medical care. The bones of ordinary Egyptians tell a story of relentless wear, of lives lived bent beneath the sun, of bodies consumed by the very work that sustained the state. If eternity was the goal, it was achieved only in the sense that each generation repeated the suffering of the last. The land was eternal, the labour eternal, the suffering eternal. Only the names of the sufferers disappeared. Despite the hardships, fields could also be places of familiarity, even camaraderie. Families worked side by side. Neighbours shared tools. Songs rose over the fields to coordinate rhythm. There was a shared understanding that everyone was bound to the same cycle, that no one was exempt from the overseer's watch. Yet even this sense of community was shadowed by competition and suspicion, for quotas demanded results, and failure could invite punishment not only for one household, but for entire groups. In a system that extracted so much, solidarity was fragile, constantly undermined by scarcity and fear. Agriculture was not simply work. It was obligation, enshrined in law and custom. Taxes were calculated in grain. Corvée labour could be demanded to maintain canals, and the expectation of service-bound villagers more tightly than any chain. There was no escape from the fields, for even when the crops were cut and the granaries filled, the state found new uses for surplus bodies. If the land did not need you, the temples or construction projects would. The same hands that sowed seed in mud could be made to haul stone in quarries or carry bricks for palaces. Thus, agriculture was both the defining labour and the proving ground for every Egyptian. The fields consumed your body, the taxes consumed your harvest, and the overseers consumed your freedom. Not all Egyptians spent their lives bent double in the fields. Some were spared the back-breaking monotony of sowing and harvesting, only to be thrown into other forms of drudgery that filled their lungs with dust, blistered their hands, or ruined their eyesight. The category of craftsman carried a faint air of dignity, at least compared to anonymous field labourers, yet the distinction was mostly cosmetic. Whether you were a potter shaping clay, a carpenter cutting timber, a weaver at a loom, or a hauler in a quarry, the outcome was the same: a body consumed by work, leaving behind objects that lasted longer than the hands that made them. And while the state immortalised its kings in stone, it rarely bothered to carve the names of the men who dragged those stones into place. Eternity, as always, belonged to someone else. Potters were among the most common craftsmen, producing the jars, bowls and amphorae that made storage, cooking and transport possible. Their workshops reeked of damp clay, smoke from kilns and the acrid tang of glaze. Clay dust coated hair, skin and lungs, embedding itself so deeply that coughing was a constant soundtrack. The shaping of vessels on simple wheels required precision and muscle, and one mistake could collapse hours of effort into a lump of wasted clay. Firing was even riskier. A badly tended kiln meant cracked pots, warped jars, and wasted fuel. The irony was that pottery was essential and omnipresent. Every household needed it. Yet potters themselves lived on the edge of poverty, their own homes filled with chipped seconds and smoke-stained air. The jars they made might outlast them by centuries, but their names, if recorded at all, dissolved before their bones. Carpenters fared little better. Wood was scarce in Egypt, imported from Lebanon or Nubia for anything beyond local palm and acacia. To be a carpenter was to constantly work against shortages, adapting to knots, cracks, and warped pieces. The smell of resin, sawdust, and sweat filled their workshops, accompanied by the thudding of adzes and the rasp of saws. Splinters lodged in hands and infected easily in the hot, dusty climate. Eyes strained in dim light and backs ached from bending over low benches. Their products, stools, beds, chests, tools, and the beams that supported roofs, were indispensable, yet their makers rarely enjoyed them in comfort. A carpenter might sleep on a mat in a mud brick house, knowing his hands had built the furniture reserved for wealthier homes. Even when their skills were applied to coffins or elaborate temple fittings, carpenters remained invisible, their artistry anonymous, their labour consumed by institutions that valued the product but never the maker. Weavers, many of them women, worked endlessly at looms to produce linen, the fabric of Egypt. The whir of spindles and the clack of looms filled small rooms where light filtered dimly through narrow slits in walls. Threads tangled, broke, and required constant reworking, leaving fingers raw. Dust from flax fibres lodged in nostrils, throats, and eyes, causing irritation that never truly cleared. Linen was Egypt's pride, worn by rich and poor alike, exported abroad, wrapped around the dead. Yet the women who wove it did so in stifling rooms that smelled of sweat and smoke, their children underfoot, their backs curved by long hours of sitting on reed mats. The irony was stark. The linen shrouds they produced swaddled kings for eternity, while their own bodies decomposed in shallow graves, clothed in rags. Stone haulers and quarrymen endured perhaps the most brutal conditions of all. While farmers bent in fields, these men bent beneath blocks of limestone, granite, and sandstone, dragging them on sledges or levering them into place. Quarries blazed under the sun, white stone reflecting light so fiercely it burned the eyes. Workers squinted until they went half blind, their faces reddened and peeling. Dust rose in choking clouds with every strike of a chisel, lodging deep in lungs, coating tongues with a taste like chalk. Tools were basic, copper or later bronze chisels that dulled quickly, stone hammers that shattered easily, ropes that frayed under strain. Injuries were constant, broken bones from falling rock, crushed limbs beneath sledges, deep gashes from sharp stone edges, collapsed scaffolds, killed without ceremony, burying men under the very blocks meant to glorify gods and kings. And still the work continued, because it had to. These quarrymen and builders gave Egypt its most enduring monuments, though their own endurance was short. The pyramids, temples, and tombs that still draw awe today were assembled not by divine decree, but by sweat, dust, and blood. Tomb reliefs show neat rows of workers pulling ropes in harmony, their bodies stylized and strong, their faces calm. The reality was closer to blistered palms, shoulders rubbed raw and lungs full of dust. Whips cracked when ropes slackened. Overseers barked when men faltered. Deaths went unrecorded, their bodies dumped in shallow pits, while the monument rose ever higher. The names carved in stone belonged to pharaohs, not to the thousands who made the stone obey. The irony was almost cruelly perfect. The glory of eternity was built by men condemned to be forgotten. Not all craftsmen toiled in quarries or kilns. Some were trained in more specialized trades. Goldsmiths sculptors, or scribes of hieroglyphs. Yet even here, the balance favoured the elite. A sculptor might chisel an exquisite statue of a pharaoh, capturing the eternal serenity of his face, only to die with his own face unrecorded. A goldsmith might fashion a necklace of delicate faience or beaten gold, yet never taste the security such wealth implied. Their skills brought them marginally better conditions, but not true independence. They worked under commission, bound to the whims of patrons, temples, or the state. To be skilled was to be less expendable, perhaps, but it was not to be free. Danger in workshops came not only from tools, but from environment. Kilns overheated and collapsed, suffocating workers inside. Fires spread through reed-thatched roofs, consuming whole neighbourhoods. Saws and chisels cut too deep. Wounds festered in the heat, and crude poultices offered little protection from infection. A carpenter who slipped might lose a finger. A weaver might go blind from years of eye strain. A potter might collapse from fumes inhaled at the kiln. Work did not stop for such injuries. A crippled worker was a burden, supported grudgingly by family, pitied briefly, then forgotten. The system had no place for those who could not contribute. Eternity demanded able bodies, and when bodies broke, they were replaced. For craftsmen, pride existed, but was bittersweet. A potter could point to his jars in households, a weaver to her linen on a noble, a quarryman to the temple that towered above the horizon. Yet none of this pride translated to recognition or comfort. Their creations outlasted them, yes, but without their names. Archaeologists marvel at the durability of Egyptian pottery, the fineness of linen threads, the precision of carved stone. The people who made them remain faceless, their identities dissolved into the anonymity of labour. Eternity honoured kings and gods. Labourers offered eternity without being granted it themselves. This cycle of labour was not confined to men alone. While many worked in workshops or quarries, their households did not rest in their absence. Women remained behind, sustaining homes with their own unending work. The grindstone turned daily, beer brewed endlessly, linen woven without pause. Children were raised in smoke-filled rooms. Goats and chickens tended, floors patched and swept. The household itself was another workshop, one that produced not monuments or goods but survival. And while men hauled stone or fired kilns, women laboured in obscurity, their sweat no less essential, their names no less forgotten. To speak of craftsmen and builders is therefore to speak of households stretched thin, each member labouring in parallel, all their energy consumed by the same unrelenting system. Domestic work was invisible precisely because it was constant. The household ran on women's hands, and the endless cycle of grinding, baking, weaving, and nursing consumed lives so thoroughly that little else remained. To live as a woman in ancient Egypt was to rise each day into a list of tasks that began before dawn and ended only when exhaustion silenced the body. It was not glamorous and it was not celebrated, but without it families would have collapsed within a week. Eternity, in its practical form, was ensured by women turning grindstones, stoking hearths, and bending over looms until their spines gave way. Grain grinding was perhaps the most relentless of these tasks. Emmer wheat, the basis of bread, had to be pounded and ground by hand using stone querns. Women knelt on mats for hours, rocking heavy stones, back and forth across grain until it broke into flour. The motion was repetitive, back-breaking, and unending. Knees pressed into hard floors, muscles ached from constant use, and dust rose with every stroke, coating skin and lungs alike. Archaeological remains confirm the toll. The skeletons of women show damage to knees, hips, and spines from decades of grinding. Their teeth, like men's, were worn down by the stone grit that slipped into flour, so that every meal inflicted further damage. Yet the grindstone never stopped, because bread was the foundation of survival. Without women bent over querns, there was no bread, and without bread, there was no life. Baking was the next step, carried out in the same smoky spaces where families lived and slept. Clay ovens glowed red, filling homes with heat even in the height of summer. Loaves were shaped by hand, dusted with flour, and shoved into the ovens with sticks. The smell of baking bread mixed with smoke, sweat, and the acrid tang of dung used as fuel. Women worked near flames that scorched skin, bent low over ovens that choked lungs, and endured burns from sudden flare-ups. Bread was baked hard, intended to last for days, and when it emerged it carried with it not only the taste of grain, but the lingering bitterness of smoke. The work was daily, repetitive, and essential. Every loaf represented hours of labour, though the product was eaten in minutes, its significance forgotten as soon as hunger abated. Beer brewing was another cornerstone of women's responsibilities. Beer was Egypt's universal drink, and it was made in the home as regularly as bread. The process began with loaves of bread baked half done, crumbled into jars of water, and left to ferment. Women tended the jars, stirring the mixture, straining it through reeds, and skimming off scum that rose to the surface. The smell was pungent: sour yeast, damp grain, and the sharp tang of alcohol. Children drank this beer as readily as adults, for it was safer than water, but brewing it meant constant vigilance. Jars tipped or spoiled easily, insects swarmed to the sweet residue, and batches went wrong more often than not. Beer was caloric fuel, as essential as bread, and like bread it fell squarely under women's domain. No matter how repetitive or unpleasant, the jars had to be tended, and the drink had to be made anew each day. Weaving linen consumed other hours, for clothing and household goods did not replace themselves. Flax was harvested, beaten, spun into thread, and woven on simple looms. Women sat on mats or stools, working thread through heddles, their eyes strained by dim light, filtering through small wall slits. The rooms smelled of flax dust, sweat, and oil used to soften fibres. Threads broke often, requiring constant repair, and finished cloth was laboriously bleached or dyed. Linen was Egypt's pride, used for clothing, sails, and wrappings for the dead. Yet its creation was an unending drain on women's time and bodies. Fingers blistered, eyes strained, and spines bent under hours of stillness. The irony was bitter. The linen produced by these women-clothed priests decorated temples and wrapped kings for eternity, while the weavers themselves died in obscurity, clothed in rags. Childbirth added yet another burden, one far more dangerous than grinding or weaving. Women gave birth at home, without physicians or trained attendants, relying on female relatives and neighbours for support. Pain relief was non-existent, save for herbal poultices or whispered prayers. Complications were common, and deaths frequent. Infant mortality was staggering. Many children never reached adulthood, their tiny bodies buried in shallow pits near villages. Mothers often bore child after child, each pregnancy depleting their strength further. To be a woman was to expect that childbirth might kill you, or that your child might not survive the week. The grief was private, rarely recorded, but it was constant, a shadow that hung over every household. And yet families kept trying, because labour demanded children to replace their parents when bodies finally broke. Household chores layered endlessly atop these larger duties. Women hauled jars of water from the river, balancing heavy loads on shoulders or heads. They tended small animals, goats, pigs, chickens, sweeping their droppings, feeding them scraps, and defending them from predators. They patched walls with fresh mud, smeared dung over floors to seal cracks, and spread reed mats for sleeping. They cooked stews of beans or lentils, roasted onions, and preserved fish, filling homes with the mingled odours of necessity. They cleaned clothing in the Nile, beating it against stones until fibres frayed, their hands raw from constant abrasion. No task was glamorous, but every task was essential, and there was never a day without them. Elite women lived differently, though their lives were hardly free from burden. Wealthy households employed servants to grind, bake and weave, sparing mistresses the worst of the labour. Some women of high rank held property, managed estates, or even served as priestesses, their lives recorded in inscriptions. Yet even for them, the framework of expectation remained. Their value was tied to their households, their ability to produce heirs, and their support of the system. While they escaped the grindstone, they were no freer from the pressures of survival, only cushioned by wealth. Their comforts rested on the unending labour of poorer women, who wove their linens, brewed their beer, and raised the children who served them. The daily work of women sustained not only families, but the broader state. Bread and beer kept men alive in fields and quarries, linen-clothed priests and wrapped mummies. Children replenished the workforce. Without women's labour, the entire illusion of eternal Egypt would have collapsed. Yet their contribution went almost entirely unacknowledged. In tomb art, women appear as graceful figures, offering flowers or carrying baskets, their labour stylised into elegance. The reality was sweat-soaked hair, blistered fingers, aching backs, and lives shortened by exhaustion. Eternity had little interest in their names or their burdens. Their monuments were the calluses on their hands, erased when their bodies returned to dust. Despite the endless cycle of labour, women also bore responsibility for creating moments of order, even comfort. They tended shrines within households, offering scraps of bread or drops of beer to protective gods. They told stories to children in smoky rooms, sang songs while grinding grain, and soothed the sick with herbal remedies. These small acts stitched together daily life, providing continuity across generations. Yet even here, the work was never separate from exhaustion. Songs were sung while hands ached at looms, prayers whispered while kneeling over grinding stones. There was no separation between labour and life, for labour was life. The sensory world of women's work was relentless. The scrape of stone against grain, the thud of loaves into ovens, the sour ferment of beer, the hiss of threads pulled taut, the cries of infants, the smell of sweat mingled with smoke, all filled every hour of every day. There was no silence, no reprieve, no empty time. The house itself was an echo chamber of labour, amplifying the unending rhythm of survival. For men, home might be a place of rest after fields or quarries. For women, home was another workplace, demanding from dawn to dusk, swallowing every ounce of energy. This was the foundation of Egypt's eternity. Women labouring invisibly, producing the bread, beer, linen, and children that kept the machine turning. Their lives were rarely carved in stone, but their work ensured that stone could be carved at all. Without them, temples would have lacked offerings, fields would have lacked labourers, and kings would have lacked monuments. Yet the system they sustained gave them nothing in return but obscurity. Their names dissolved, their bodies decomposed, their burdens forgotten. What remained was the work, passed on to daughters who learned the grindstone as soon as they could walk. And so the cycle continued. Each generation of women took up the same tasks, their lives repeating with little variation, their burdens unending. The grinding stone turned, the ovens smoked, the looms clattered, the jars fermented, and the children cried. From birth to death, women's existence was woven into labour, indistinguishable from the household itself. Children in ancient Egypt were not preserved in serene stillness, like the chubby, lotus-holding figures painted on tomb walls. They were noisy, dirty, and restless, and from the moment they could stand, they were folded into the machinery of survival. A household was not a space where children were shielded from the world until they were old enough to contribute. It was a workshop, and every small pair of hands was expected to take part. Childhood was brief, less an era of play than a short apprenticeship in the monotony that would define adulthood. If games and laughter existed, and they did, they were squeezed between chores, and they carried the background awareness that many of those laughing voices would fall silent before they reached maturity. Play, when it happened, was resourceful rather than indulgent. Children moulded toys out of mud or clay, simple figurines of animals, balls shaped from linen rags, or spinning tops cut from discarded wood. Dolls fashioned with string hair appeared in wealthier households, but most children made do with whatever scraps lay at hand. Stick games were common, children chasing one another through alleys, striking makeshift balls or simply clashing sticks until they splintered. The laughter of children echoed in villages, but it was never free of context. Mothers grinding grain scolded children to keep the noise down. Fathers sent them to shoo birds from fields, and neighbours barked reminders that playtime ended as soon as water needed hauling. Games did not define childhood, work did, and games filled the gaps between obligations. Chores began early. Children fetched water in jars nearly as large as themselves, their small frames straining under the weight as they staggered from the Nile to the house. The jars left welts on shoulders and sore spots on heads, but the work was unavoidable. Others were sent to gather fuel, collecting dung or reeds to feed the smoky hearths. Slightly older children herded goats or sheep, walking them along dusty tracks, shouting to keep them in line, throwing stones at predators, or simply to assert control. Even the youngest were expected to carry small tasks, sweeping dirt floors with bundles of reeds, pounding grain alongside their mothers, or watching infants while women worked. Childhood was not a sanctuary. It was a gradual initiation into the same fatigue that consumed parents. The sensory palette of childhood was therefore a mixture of play and burden. The cool feel of clay between fingers hardened into the ache of raw palms after grinding stones. The laughter of chasing games was punctuated by the bleating of goats refusing to cooperate. The taste of sweet dates, rare treats on festival days, was overwhelmed by the sourness of beer watered down for children's daily drink. The warmth of family fires came with the sting of smoke in eyes and lungs. For Egyptian children, joy was fragile, and its fragility was sharpened by the omnipresent reality that not every child would live to adulthood. Infant and child mortality hung heavily over every household. Disease spread easily in cramped villages, carried by flies, spoiled food, and water crawling with parasites. Diarrheal illness was common and often fatal, leaving infants dehydrated within days. Respiratory infections spread in smoky rooms, stifling tiny lungs. Malnutrition weakened bodies, leaving them prey to ailments that might have been shrugged off by stronger constitutions. Graves reveal that many children never reached their teens. Some never survived infancy. Families buried their dead in shallow pits, sometimes wrapped in scraps of linen, sometimes in nothing at all. The grief private but frequent. It was not uncommon for parents to lose multiple children, and for surviving children to grow up knowing they were only partial replacements for siblings gone too soon. Despite this grim backdrop, families invested in their children because they had no choice. Children represented labour, future security, and the only possible continuity in a world where houses crumbled and names dissolved. From the moment they could speak, children absorbed the tasks of their households. Daughters learned grinding, weaving, brewing, and childcare from their mothers, mimicking the motions of hands turning querns or adjusting looms. Sons learned fieldwork, carpentry, or pottery from fathers, following behind with smaller tools, watching, imitating, and eventually performing the same gestures until their own bodies carried the same rhythm. Childhood was less about discovery and more about rehearsal. Discipline was firm, sometimes brutal. Overseers carried sticks in the fields, and fathers carried them at home. Tomb texts and school writings make frequent mention of the rod, praising its ability to instill obedience and skill. A child who shirked chores was not only a nuisance, but a danger, threatening the fragile balance of survival. Whippings and scoldings were not exceptional punishments, but routine corrections. The body of a child was shaped into endurance as surely as clay was shaped into jars. Bruises faded quickly, and children who resisted learned soon enough that resistance carried costs. Authority was enforced at every level, from the gods down to the family hearth, and children absorbed their place in this hierarchy long before adulthood. Education, in the formal sense, was a rarity. Sons of the elite, or those destined for administrative work, might be taught to read and write in scribal schools. These boys sat cross-legged with pallets of reed pens and pots of ink, copying lines of hieroglyphs until they could reproduce them without error. Their schools smelled of ink, papyrus, and sweat, filled with the scraping sound of reeds on papyrus and the sharp commands of teachers. Lessons emphasized obedience as much as literacy. Texts survive that praise the scribe's life as an escape from drudgery, while threatening students with beatings for mistakes. To learn to write was to step onto a narrow path of privilege, one that removed the child from the fields and set him on a course toward temple service or bureaucratic work. For most, however, this path was closed. Literacy remained the domain of a few, while the overwhelming majority of children were destined for manual labour. Daughters almost never entered scribal schools, their education confined to household skills, their futures predetermined as wives, mothers, and labourers. Sons who were not among the privileged majority learned tools rather than texts. They memorised not hieroglyphs, but the feel of soil beneath their nails, the weight of hoes, the rhythm of hammer and chisel. For every boy copying lines of scripture, hundreds more were bent double in fields, chasing goats or stirring clay in kilns. Education existed not to liberate the masses, but to reinforce the narrow ladder that lifted a few above them. The contrast between possibility and reality was cruel. Scribes and priests wrote hymns celebrating the eternal order of Egypt, their bellies filled and their backs unbroken. Meanwhile, most children who had once dreamed idly while shaping clay toys found themselves bound to the same grindstones and sickles that consumed their parents. Mortality ensured that some never reached that stage at all, their toys buried with them in shallow graves, silent reminders that joy was fleeting. Those who did survive inherited not wealth or opportunity, but obligation. They became new bodies in fields, new hands at looms, new backs bent under loads. Childhood, in this sense, was less a stage of life than a waiting room for labour. Yet even within this inevitability, there were differences of degree. Wealthy children played with carved dolls, painted toys, and miniature chariots. Their lives insulated by servants and slaves. They ate sweeter food, wore finer linen, and sometimes learned to read. Their chances of survival were marginally higher, though still far from guaranteed. They grew up surrounded by comfort that most children never imagined. Yet even for them, the structure of expectation remained firm. Girls would still be married for alliances, their value tied to households and reproduction. while boys would still be folded into service to temples or the state. Wealth softened the edges of childhood, but did not erase its brevity or its constraints. For the majority, childhood was an apprenticeship in endurance. The memories of play were quickly overshadowed by memories of work, of fetching water beneath the sun, of hands rubbed raw by grindstones, of nights coughing in smoky rooms. The laughter of chasing games faded into the weary sighs of adolescents already labouring like adults. Childhood was not lost. It had never been offered in the first place. It was simply compressed into brief, fragile moments that dissolved beneath the weight of necessity. And so children in ancient Egypt grew quickly, or not at all. Many did not live long enough to shoulder their full share of work. Those who did survived by becoming replicas of their parents, their lives prescripted by circumstance. Only a few scribes and priests stepped onto a path that carried them away from manual labour, lifted by literacy into the bureaucracy or the temple. These figures became symbols of escape, evidence that another life was possible, however inaccessible it remained to most. If scribes represented one narrow escape from manual labour, it was not an escape from the all-encompassing presence of the gods. Education in the art of writing was inseparable from a religion, because nearly every document worth recording, hymns, tax rolls, lists of offerings, served the temple as much as the state. Literacy was not neutral, it belonged to the divine bureaucracy. To learn to read and write was to become an intermediary between ordinary life and the gods, to serve the structures that claim to mediate eternity. And yet, even those who never touched a pen could not avoid religion's reach. It framed every aspect of existence, from the smallest domestic gesture to the most lavish festival, imposing meaning and extracting resources in equal measure. At the household level, religion looked humble. Families tucked clay figurines into wall niches, their crude shapes representing protective deities such as Bes, the squat, leonine dwarf who guarded homes, or Taweret, the hippo goddess who protected women in childbirth. Offerings were small: a crust of bread, a splash of beer, a garland of dried flowers. The smell of incense or resin, when available, was offered to mask the stench of hearth smoke and animal dung as much as to please a god. These rituals were intimate, tied to the daily grind of survival, asking for protection against snakes, fertility for crops, or health for infants. To an outsider, such acts might appear perfunctory, but for families living with constant vulnerability, they represented one of the few tools available to push back against uncertainty. Yet above these modest shrines loomed the temples, vast estates that consumed land, labour and grain. Temples to Amun, Ra, Hathor or Osiris dominated towns and cities, their walls covered in reliefs depicting offerings and rituals in perfect orderly lines. Within these compounds lived armies of priests, scribes, labourers and servants, all supported by the constant inflow of produce, collected as offerings or taxes. The irony was sharp. While the state demanded grain quotas for its granaries, the gods demanded their own, channeled into temple storehouses that sometimes rivaled those of the palace. Religion promised comfort, but it also demanded a toll, one that ordinary Egyptians could ill afford to neglect. To fail in your duties to the gods was to risk misfortune, and to risk misfortune was to invite ruin. Temple rituals themselves were elaborate but largely hidden from ordinary eyes. Priests bathed multiple times a day, shaved their bodies and donned fine linen before entering sanctuaries to present food, wine, incense and hymns to the gods. Statues were washed, clothed and fed in rituals that portrayed deities as honoured monarchs. To the average farmer or craftsman standing outside the walls, the rituals were distant, a mystery of chanting and smoke drifting from courtyards. They could not enter the innermost sanctuaries. Their role was to provide the offerings that made the rituals possible. For them, the gods remained as aloof as their priests, accepting endless sacrifices in exchange for nothing more tangible than the hope that crops would grow and plagues would pass. Festivals provided the rare moments when religion spilled into the streets, when the gods left their hidden sanctuaries and became visible to the masses. During these processions, statues of deities were carried on gilded barges or litters, shaded by canopies, while priests, musicians, and dancers surrounded them. Drums thundered, sistrums rattled, incense filled the air, and crowds pressed close to glimpse the divine image. For the ordinary villager, this was perhaps the only time they saw their gods face to face, though always from a distance, shielded by guards and priests. Beer flowed during festivals, food was shared, and the monotony of labour briefly gave way to the intoxication of spectacle. But the cost of these spectacles was borne by the people themselves. For the offerings, the grain, the cattle sacrificed, all came ultimately from their fields, their herds, and their labour. Religion offered psychological comfort as well as obligation. The gods were invoked at births, marriages, and funerals, woven into every milestone of life. Hymns described a world where divine order, Mahat, held chaos at bay, where proper worship ensured harmony and balance. For people whose lives were otherwise dominated by drudgery, this worldview provided reassurance that their suffering was not meaningless, but part of a cosmic plan. To live and labour under the sun was to maintain balance, to support the gods who supported creation itself. The irony, of course, was that the cosmic balance always seemed to favour the priests, the officials, and the pharaoh, while ordinary Egyptians provided the fuel. Still, to reject the gods was unthinkable. Without them, the chaos of famine, flood, or disease loomed even larger. Taxes to the temples came not only in grain, but in labour. Families could be drafted to work on temple estates, tending fields owned by the gods, hauling stone for shrines, or weaving linen for priests' garments. These duties were called offerings as much as obligations, for the distinction between piety and coercion was blurred. To labour for the temple was framed as service to eternity, but the immediate reality was hauling jars, grinding grain, or sweating in workshops, tasks as mundane and exhausting as any performed for the state. Religion and governance were fused into one apparatus, each reinforcing the other, ensuring that the Nile's abundance flowed steadily upward, away from those who produced it. The sensory world of religion reflected this duality. In households, rituals smelled of hearth smoke and stale beer, punctuated by muttered prayers. In temples, rituals glowed with torchlight, the air thick with incense, the clang of bronze instruments echoing off stone walls. Festivals exploded with colour and sound, the shimmer of gold, the rhythm of drums, the press of sweating bodies in celebration. For a brief time, people could feel swept up in something larger than themselves, intoxicated not only by beer, but by the illusion of participation in divine order. Yet when the drums faded and the statues returned to their sanctuaries, the obligations remained. The gods were fed, but the people returned home hungry, their offerings given without any guarantee of return. The afterlife, too, was framed through religion, and it was another arena where illusions clashed with reality. Tomb texts promised eternal banquets, endless fields that harvested themselves, and serene repose beneath lotus blossoms. Wealthy families filled their tombs with food, tools, and charms, convinced that death was simply a continuation of privilege. Ordinary Egyptians, however, could not afford such insurance. Their burials were shallow, their offerings modest or non-existent, their chances of enjoying eternity uncertain at best. Religion promised eternity for all, but the material reality of preparation meant eternity was once again reserved for the few. For the rest, death was silence, their names forgotten, their bones left unwrapped. Despite this inequality, religion endured because it was woven seamlessly into daily life. A woman grinding grain might whisper a prayer to Taweret for protection in childbirth. A farmer planting seed might mutter to Osiris for a good harvest. A craftsman chiselling stone might glance toward a shrine to Ptah, asking that his tools not break. These small acts required little and offered reassurance that someone somewhere was listening. And when illness struck, when crops failed, when children died, religion was the first place people turned, offering sacrifices, charms, and prayers in desperation. The gods could be aloof, but they could also be invoked. And when survival was fragile, invocation was often the only option left. Thus religion was both comfort and control, sustenance and burden. It gave meaning to suffering, while ensuring suffering was never alleviated. It created bonds of community during festivals, while draining resources through offerings and taxes. It provided explanations for disease, famine, or death, while ensuring that solutions were never sought outside divine favour. It was omnipresent, because it had to be. Without it, the contradictions of Egyptian life might have been too stark to bear. The body of an ancient Egyptian was fragile, not because it was weak, but because it was overworked, underfed, and constantly assaulted by its environment. Labour began in childhood, and rarely eased until death. Bones bent under the repetition of the same motions. Teeth crumbled beneath the grit of stone-dusted bread, and skin burned beneath the same sun that scorched the fields for centuries. The medical papyri that survive speak loftily of diagnoses and remedies, but the daily reality was that most people lived with pain as a constant companion. To be Egyptian was to endure an unending catalogue of ailments, none of which merited much sympathy because everyone around you carried the same burdens. Disease and injury were not exceptional events, they were the background hum of existence. Teeth in particular bore the greatest punishment. Bread ground on sandstone querns left flour filled with minute fragments of grit, and every meal slowly eroded enamel away. By middle age, many mouths were ruined, teeth worn flat, nerves exposed, and infections rampant. Jawbones from mummies and skeletons reveal abscesses that would have caused constant agony, swelling faces, and slow deaths from blood poisoning. Remedies for tooth pain existed, pastes of herbs, resins, and honey pressed against gums, but they were palliative rather than curative. Some texts even recommended plugging holes with ground barley or applying poultices of fig and natron, neither of which stopped the decay. Dentistry, in the modern sense, did not exist. One endured the pain until the tooth fell out or the sufferer succumbed. To eat was to injure oneself, and there was no way around it. Blindness was another common affliction. The Nile Valley swarmed with flies, attracted by waste, rot, and the ever-present smell of fish. They clustered at the corners of eyes, spreading infections that left many scarred or blinded. Trachoma, a bacterial disease carried by flies, inflamed eyelids until lashes turned inward, scraping corneas raw. Children were particularly vulnerable, their eyes watering constantly as flies gathered in relentless swarms. Treatments ranged from herbal ointments mixed with honey to more dubious applications of animal fat or even dung, believed to draw out infection. Some remedies soothed temporarily, others only worsened the problem. Priests might prescribe amulets carved with protective symbols of Horus's eye, invoking divine protection against blindness. Yet the gods proved no more reliable than medicine, and blindness was accepted as one of life's many inevitabilities. Parasites plagued Egyptians as relentlessly as insects. The Nile was both lifeline and curse, carrying silt for crops, but also harbouring worms and flukes that infested bodies through drinking water or wading in canals. Schistosomiasis, caused by parasites burrowing through skin, enlarged spleens caused blood in urine and left bellies distended. Intestinal worms caused chronic pain, bloating, and malnutrition, symptoms so commonplace that they barely merited comment. Fish and undercooked meat transmitted further parasites, while lice and fleas ensured that even the skin was not safe. The body itched, ached, and bloated, and these conditions were not treated as unusual illnesses, but as permanent features of life. Surviving meant carrying them without complaint, until weakness finally overcame endurance. Injuries were equally commonplace. Field labour bent backs and inflamed joints, leaving many arthritic before 30. Quarry work shattered bones, with falling rock or collapsing scaffolds. Workshops filled with smoke and sharp tools left hands scarred, eyes damaged, and lungs clogged. There were no hospitals, no surgeries in the sense we know them. A broken limb might be splinted with reeds and cloth, but infection often followed. Cuts festered in the heat, filling with pus, drawing flies, burns from ovens, scarred arms permanently, and there was no treatment beyond poultices of honey or grease. Women faced the additional dangers of childbirth, where hemorrhage, obstructed labour, and infection could kill with brutal efficiency. The midwives and relatives who attended could offer encouragement, amulets, and perhaps a herbal draught of poppy to dull the pain, but they could not save a woman whose womb tore or whose child lodged fatally in the birth canal. Death in childbirth was common, so much so that it barely interrupted the routines of life. The remedies Egyptians turned to were a mixture of genuine insight and startling absurdity. Honey, for example, was rightly prized for its antibacterial properties. Used to dress wounds and soothe sore throats, garlic and onions were applied to infections, their sulphurous bite recognised as somehow protective. Willow bark, containing a precursor to aspirin, was chewed to dull pain. These treatments worked, at least modestly, and show a surprising empirical knowledge. Yet alongside them sat recipes that seem almost comically futile. Poultices of animal dung pressed against wounds to draw out disease, crocodile dung mixed with honey for contraception, or lizard's blood prescribed for ailments of the blood. Incantations accompanied many prescriptions, muttered spells meant to summon divine assistance. The line between pharmacology and magic was blurred, because in a world so saturated with suffering, people clutched at anything that offered hope. Medicine was as much about ritual as remedy. Amulets were worn against disease, inscribed with images of protective gods or magical formulas. Children wore amulets shaped like the eye of Horus to guard their health. Pregnant women kept figurines of Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, hoping her protection would prevent tragedy. Priests served as healers, reciting spells while applying ointments, invoking gods to banish demons believed to cause sickness. Illness was rarely viewed as purely physical. It was often attributed to malevolent spirits, the anger of gods, or imbalance in the cosmic order. Healing, therefore, required both material and spiritual intervention, for disease was as much a metaphysical problem as a medical one. The experience of illness was visceral, unavoidable, and humiliating. The taste of foul water lingered in mouths, bellies cramped with worms, eyes crusted with infection, stung with every blink. Toothaches pulsed day and night, pain radiating through skulls. Fevers burned through villages, leaving bodies shaking, drenched in sweat. Weak and useless for days. There were no sick days. Work continued unless the body refused. And when the body refused, families bore the burden, watching another pair of hands removed from the endless chain of labour. Illness stripped dignity, reducing strong men to moans, women to tears, children to silence. There was no privacy in sickness, no escape from the eyes of family or neighbours. Suffering was public, visible in every cough, limp and groan that filled the air of villages. What strikes modern observers is not simply the volume of ailments, but the endurance with which Egyptians carried them. Pain was normalised, complaint minimised, because everyone shared the same afflictions. An abscessed tooth was not a tragedy, it was expected. Blindness was not unusual. It was a phase of ageing. Parasites were not invaders. They were as common as flies. Suffering was democratised, spread evenly across society, a constant hum that underpinned every task. The body was fragile, but the system was not, because it required only that enough bodies endured long enough to sustain it. Those who faltered were replaced by children, and the cycle continued. The wealthy fared somewhat better, but not by much. They could afford more elaborate remedies, more honey, more incense, more prayers. Their tombs preserved medical papyri, filled with recipes and incantations, evidence of their attempt to guard health with knowledge. But wealth did not exempt them from parasites, tooth decay, or childbirth complications. Pharaohs themselves carried the same dental abscesses and arthritis as their subjects, their mummies revealing bodies every bit as ravaged by diet and disease. Eternity might have preserved their names, but it did not preserve their flesh from the same indignities of grit, worms and infection. In this sense, health was the great equalizer, stripping even kings of the illusion of divine immunity. Despite the limitations of medicine, there was a cultural insistence on its importance. Healing was one of the ways Egyptians resisted the helplessness of their world. The rituals, the poultices, the amulets, even when they failed, they allowed people to act, to fight back against the inevitability of decay. Doing nothing was unthinkable, because to do nothing was to admit defeat. Better to smear dung on a wound than to sit idle. Better to whisper a prayer to a figurine than to accept blindness as fate. In that insistence lay a kind of defiance, however futile, against the relentless erosion of the body. Ancient Egyptians did not live lives devoid of joy, but their pleasures were fragile things, constantly overshadowed by the demands of work, taxes, and survival. Yet despite the exhaustion of fields and workshops, people carved out spaces to gather, to drink, to sing, and to pretend, however briefly, that life offered more than repetition. Leisure was not abundant, but it was essential. Without these moments of reprieve, the weight of eternity might have been too much to bear. Beer was the foundation of most gatherings, as essential to leisure as it was to daily survival. Jars of thick, sour liquid were passed from hand to hand in courtyards, their contents consumed with noisy gulps and grimaces that gave way to laughter as intoxication set in. The taste was hardly pleasant, a slurry of bread, grain and yeast, flecked with floating residue, but its effect was undeniable. Beer dulled the ache of muscles, loosened tongues, and made even the harshest realities feel momentarily softer. Courtyards echoed with laughter, songs and drunken arguments, while the air carried the smell of spilled beer mixing with dust and smoke. Men staggered, women teased, children imitated their elders with mock toasts, and for a few hours monotony dissolved in intoxication. Music and dance accompanied these gatherings, transforming otherwise ordinary evenings into celebrations. Flutes carved from reeds trilled high and sharp, drums thundered with steady rhythm, and rattles added texture to the soundscape. The music was not delicate, it was insistent, designed to carry over voices and to push bodies into motion. Dancers, often women, performed in courtyards and festival spaces. their movements exaggerated, their bodies gleaming with oil that caught the torchlight. The air vibrated with rhythm, feet stamped against packed earth, and voices rose in chants. For those watching, music and dance offered escape from silence and suffering. For those performing, it was work as much as art, but it carried its own pleasure in its intensity. In these moments, the body was not only an instrument of labour, but also an instrument of expression. Board games also provided diversion, particularly the game of senet, played on grids of carved wood or scratched into mud brick. Small pieces were moved according to the throw of sticks or knuckle bones, their progress representing the passage of the soul through the afterlife. It was a game of both chance and symbolism, one that offered strategy as well as spiritual reassurance. Families crouched around boards, arguing over moves, children learning the rules with eager shouts. The clatter of pieces and the laughter of players filled smoky rooms, providing distraction from hunger or fatigue. Senet was not simply a pastime, it was a reflection of Egypt's obsession with eternity, but distilled into something accessible, a rare moment when ordinary people could imagine themselves in control of fate, even if only on a wooden board. Festivals provided the most dramatic breaks from monotony, times when the entire community participated in collective celebration. These events, tied to the cycles of gods and agriculture, punctuated the year with spectacle. During festivals of Hathor, the goddess of love and music, villages erupted in drunken revelry. Jars of beer flowed freely, and inhibitions dissolved in dance and laughter. Hymns turned bawdy, bodies swayed in rhythm, and the seriousness of daily life gave way to intoxicated joy. At larger temples, processions carried statues of gods through the streets, shaded by canopies, accompanied by drumming, chanting, and the thick fragrance of incense. Crowds pressed close, straining for a glimpse of the divine image, shouting prayers and lifting children onto shoulders so they too could see. These festivals were sensory overload, heat from the press of bodies, the smell of sweat and beer, the shimmer of gold and linen, the pounding of drums felt in the chest as much as heard in the ears. Yet even these moments of exuberance revealed the hierarchy that structured Egyptian life. While ordinary people filled streets with song and intoxication, priests and officials controlled the centre of the spectacle. The statues of gods were carried not by common hands, but by those sanctioned to touch them. The offerings laid at temple steps drawn from the grain of villagers who had already sacrificed so much. Festivals were both release and reminder, a chance to laugh and drink, while simultaneously acknowledging the power of the institutions that permitted them. The people were allowed to rejoice, but always under the gaze of priests and pharaohs, always with the understanding that the gods' favour was mediated through those who controlled access to it. Leisure in households was more modest, but no less significant. Families told stories in the evenings, recounting myths of gods and ancestors, or simply tales of tricksters and foolish neighbours. Songs accompanied grinding grain, turning monotony into rhythm. Children played chasing games in alleys, their laughter echoing against mud brick walls. Couples found moments of intimacy in smoky rooms. Gestures of affection carved out between chores and fatigue. These small pleasures, woven into the fabric of daily life, mattered as much as grand festivals. They reminded people that joy could exist even in spaces dominated by discomfort. The warmth of a story, the rhythm of a song, the laughter of a child, these were as real as the overseer's stick or the grinding stone. The sensory texture of leisure was as vivid as its brevity. The sour tang of beer lingered on lips. The thud of drums vibrated in bones. The flicker of torchlight cast shadows that turned dancers into silhouettes of movement. The clatter of board game pieces. The smell of incense in crowded streets. The taste of onions and fish shared at communal meals, all layered into experiences that stood out against the monotony of daily existence. These moments did not erase hardship, but they created pockets of memory, fragments of life that lingered even after hunger or labour returned. For some, these were the only moments worth recalling, the only evidence that life was not entirely consumed by repetition. Still, leisure was always fleeting. Beer soured in the jar, music faded into silence, festivals ended with statues returned to sanctuaries. The next morning, the same grind awaited, fields, kilns, looms and queans. The body, briefly loosened by intoxication or laughter, stiffened again with labour. Children who played chasing games at dusk were sent to fetch water at dawn. The very brevity of leisure made it precious, but it also underscored its futility. Pleasure did not alter the structure of life, it merely punctuated it. Like the Nile's flood, it came in bursts, leaving behind memories that quickly dissolved in the relentless current of survival. The contrast between lived leisure and its depiction in art was stark. Tomb walls showed endless banquets, musicians frozen mid-performance, dancers forever caught in elegant poses. For the wealthy dead, eternity was imagined as an unending festival, a perpetual indulgence in food, drink, music, and love. Ordinary Egyptians, however, knew leisure as a temporary reprieve, a few hours stolen from exhaustion. Their banquets lasted until beer ran out, or dawn arrived, not until eternity. Their dancers grew old, their musicians lost voices, their laughter was silenced by hunger. The art promised what life never delivered, eternal pleasure carved in stone, while the reality was a handful of evenings, a scattering of festivals, and then the return to dust and labour. Leisure, then, was not just enjoyment, but defiance. It was the body asserting itself against monotony, the spirit insisting on laughter even when the world offered little to laugh about. Egyptians drank, danced, played, and celebrated, not because life was easy, but because it was hard. Joy was wrested from the same mud, dust, and smoke that consumed them, carved into fleeting moments, as fragile as clay toys or reed mats. And when those moments passed, they left behind memories that were cherished all the more for their rarity. Yet even these cherished fragments dissolved when compared to the eternal images carved into tombs, the illusions of endless joy preserved for the wealthy, while the poor lived and died with only a handful of festivals to remind them that pleasure had ever existed at all. When people today picture ancient Egypt, they almost always begin with its monuments. The pyramids rise from the desert like eternal mountains of stone, their sharp lines cutting into the horizon long after the kings who ordered them vanished into dust. Temples at Karnak and Luxor still stretch their colonnades across the sky, their carved walls filled with images of gods striding confidently, kings smiting enemies, and offerings stacked so high they seem inexhaustible. Tombs glow with painted banquets, eternal festivals where musicians pluck harps, dancers sway, and servants bear platters of bread, beer, and meat to their smiling masters. These are the images Egypt chose to preserve, the face it presented to eternity, ordered, abundant, unchanging. For the visitor staring up at these stones thousands of years later, it is easy to believe that this was Egypt, grand, serene, eternal. Yet eternity carved in stone tells only half the story. For every pyramid that endures, there were thousands of mud brick homes that melted back into the earth. For every tomb filled with carved geese and golden coffins, there were millions of bellies filled with grit-stained bread and onions. For every statue of a pharaoh preserved in polished granite, there were countless labourers who hauled the blocks, coughing on dust until their lungs gave out. The monuments proclaim eternity, but they're built upon the backs of lives erased. The glitter of stone survives, while the mud of ordinary existence dissolves without trace. To look at Egypt honestly is to see not only pyramids, but also the fields that fed them, the homes that crumbled beside them, and the faceless millions whose sweat ensured their construction. It is tempting to imagine that the grandeur of Egypt reflects the collective experience of its people. But this is another illusion. The vast majority never stepped foot inside a temple's innermost chambers, never tasted the banquets painted on tomb walls, never enjoyed the gold and perfume buried with kings. Their lives were short, hard and consumed by work. They woke on reed mats, scratched at lice, chewed bread filled with stone grit, laboured under a punishing sun, and died nameless. Their bodies were buried shallow, their graves unmarked, their names forgotten. Their contribution was not to eternity in the afterlife, but to the perpetuation of a system that promised eternity only to the few. The monuments may represent permanence, but that permanence was purchased by the impermanence of millions of lives that left no record. The irony is sharp. In Egypt's own ideology, eternity was central. Tombs promised eternal bliss, fields that harvested themselves forever, banquets that never ended. Temples proclaimed that God sustained the cosmos eternally, provided the floods eternally, upheld the order of Ma'at eternally. And in a sense, eternity was real, but it was not the eternity of paradise. It was the eternity of repetition. The same grindstones, turned by countless hands, the same fields ploughed and harvested, the same reed mats infested with pests, the same jars of sour beer passed around courtyards. Generations came and went, their faces indistinguishable, their burdens identical. Eternity was not golden, it was grey, dusty and monotonous. It was the eternity of labour that never ended, not bliss that never ended. The monuments loom because they were designed to, yet even they tell a story of absence. The pyramids may gleam, but their stones were dragged by men whose names no one recorded. Temple walls may show offerings, but they do not show the families who surrendered grain in fear of famine. Tomb art may glow with servants, but those servants were reduced to decorative props. Their real lives erased the moment paint dried. Eternity was selective, choosing to immortalize kings and priests while discarding the rest. The majority were swallowed by the sand, their existence reduced to traces of broken pottery and worn bones in shallow graves. The monuments lie by omission, preserving the few by obliterating the many. Even when fragments of ordinary life survive, a child's doll fashioned from clay, a woman's spindle whirl, a half-broken jar, they only highlight the scale of what has been lost. These objects speak to labour, to survival, to moments of humanity pressed into mud and straw, but they rarely carry names. The millions who lived in mud brick are known to us only by category: farmers, weavers, builders, mothers, children. They are faceless, collapsed into statistics, their individuality erased by the very system that depended on them. Eternity preserved their products: bread loaves fossilized in tombs, jars hardened by fire, linen wrappings around mummies, but not their stories. The eternal Egypt that visitors admire is built upon silence, a silence that grows heavier the more closely one listens. And yet in that silence there is a kind of truth. The endurance of Egypt does not lie only in stone, but in the rhythm of lives repeated endlessly, so predictable that they can be reconstructed thousands of years later. We know what people ate, what they drank, how their bodies broke down, how their homes crumbled. We know because nothing ever really changed. The eternity of Egypt is visible not only in pyramids, but in the monotony of daily life, so stable that it left a record in bones and grindstones. For the millions who lived it, this eternity was not glorious, but it was all they knew. They were anonymous, but They were the foundation. Without them, the monuments could not have risen. The temples could not have functioned. The pharaohs could not have claimed eternity at all. It is tempting, when standing before a temple, to admire the grandeur and forget the cost, to gaze at hieroglyphs praising gods and kings without remembering that each stroke was carved by a hand blistered and raw, to marvel at pyramids without recalling the lives broken beneath sledges and scaffolds, to admire painted banquets without tasting the grit that destroyed teeth or smelling the fish that rotted before it could be eaten. The monuments encourage forgetting, because forgetting was their function. They were designed to erase the burdens that sustained them, to present eternity as abundance, while hiding the eternity of suffering. Their survival is not evidence of Egypt's universal prosperity, but of its ability to concentrate labour and resources on behalf of a few. The truth is that Egypt's eternity was real, but it belonged not to the millions who lived it, but to the system that consumed them. The state endured while families dissolved, temples rose while houses crumbled, kings' names persisted in stone, while children's names faded before their grandchildren remembered them. The eternity of monuments was undeniable, but the eternity of ordinary life was repetition and erasure. Each generation carried the same burdens, ate the same gritty bread, endured the same parasites, and died in the same anonymity. Their lives sustained eternity, but they were not granted it themselves. And so the irony closes the circle. Egypt's eternity exists. It rises from the desert, gleams in the sun, draws awe from the modern world. But for the people who lived it, eternity was not golden light or eternal banquets. It was the grinding of querns, the buzzing of flies, the ache of backs bent beneath the sun. It was repetition that never ended, names that never lasted, and bodies that never escaped mud and dust. The monuments endure because millions did not. Egypt was eternal, yes, but it was the eternity of labour and erasure, not of bliss. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. A long walk, not through golden tombs or gleaming pyramids, but through mud brick homes crumbling in the flood, fields buzzing with flies, and smoky courtyards where eternity tasted mostly of grit and sour beer. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.